we have President Banda of Zambia, who I must say I have known since his previous incarnation as vice president, and then watched his ascension through elections to the presidency after the tragic death of his predecessor, and I'm delighted he's with us at this forum. Zambia has such a strong story to tell about growth and reform at the moment. Next to him is Asha-Rose Migiro, the UN Deputy Secretary General, with whom I have a special link, because I still rather jealously say she has my job, but is pulling it off in a way which should make all of Africa proud. And next to her is the Vice President of Tanzania, Vice President Shein, and we're very grateful again to Tanzania for its hospitality and for the strong presence throughout this forum of ministers and of the Vice President and of course of the President in so many sessions. And one along is the Minister of Water and Environmental Affairs of South Africa, Minister Sonjica, who again we are thrilled to have, because this is such an important portfolio in South Africa, and amongst other things it means that she's got to handle the complicated climate issues, which we'll come back to in a little while. And at the end is Donald Kaberuka, making sure I've got my order right, who we all know as the enormously effective president of the African Development Bank. So it's quite a panel, but they're going to have to answer a tough question, which is that I think probably as a European I have the right to say to them, Europe's managed to create a single president now of the European Union and a single foreign minister. It's a little bit controversial. It's not working quite as well as some of the proponents of the Lisbon Treaty hoped. But Europe, which is full of noisy member states who love to take positions and speak on their own behalf at the UN and in the G20, have nevertheless decided that if they're going to be heard in international fora, they need to start combining their voice, and there'll be one European voice. So the challenge of this session is, where's that one African voice? What is Africa doing to combine, to be able to speak more effectively on the global stage? And we'll start gently, but I think between us, you, the audience, and I, we should press our panel a bit to give us clear answers about where Africa's going on this, because otherwise, surely there's a danger that Africa's voice isn't adequately heard in international negotiations on climate or trade or security issues, if indeed it's just 50 disparate voices rather than a combined single voice. So if I may, Mr. President, if I could start with you, do you see Africa taking steps to develop a more coherent voice on global issues?
Yes, I think that it's inevitable that we have to develop one voice on international issues. It is inevitable because it was inevitable for the Europeans to do it. I think we will have to do it as well. And I think that at the climate change conference, which we had in Copenhagen, we proved that we are on our way towards having one voice, where we asked the President or Prime Minister of Ethiopia to speak for us. And many meetings took place behind the scenes to synchronize our positions. And I think we came out. We didn't get everything we wanted, but we came out very well with some kind of common position and reply from the rest of the world. I think we're going that way.
That's very good. Madam Deputy Secretary General, you're an African, but also the number 2 in the United Nations, so you see it from both ends. How well do you think Africa's doing in terms of arriving at a single voice on these issues?
Well, maybe starting as an African, I should say that I have seen African voice becoming solidified. We have had ministers, for instance, African ministers having common positions on GMOs, on health, on gender issues, like when they met only last year, 2009, on the Dakar and Platform for Actions, Beijing Platform for Actions. So the voice has been there, but it has not been that heard, that strong. But Copenhagen was a departure, and it's because of the magnitude of the impact of climate change. Here we saw the voice not only being made, but also being heard. So what I'm saying is that Africa has moved towards one voice in the past, but it became crystallized at the climate change meeting, and it's because of reasons that probably will come up in the course of this discussion.
Mr. Vice President, Tanzania, through your president, ran the AU for a year. Always a tough thing to do to get united positions. You must have been very much part of that. Do you think the AU is becoming a more effective forum for coordinating African positions?
Thank you very much. It is true, I've been working with the two different presidents for different times. Initially, I worked with President His Excellency Mkapa from 2001 to 2005, and as of from 2005 to date, I've been working closely with His Excellency President Kikwete. The AU has done quite a lot with respect to put Africa in the map of the world in terms of trying to make a one voice in issues pertaining African countries. And this became vividly during the period when we were discussing on the issue of NEPAD, for example, where we thought that document could later on pave the way for economic of Africa. Still, a lot needs to be done in that area. But the issues, as Her Excellency, the Deputy General Secretary of UN have said, the issue of GMOs, when discussed among the African countries, our country also had to contribute to the endeavors of the GMO experiences, and to see to it that Tanzania should adopt. But the discussion has been in the front line, and Tanzania was trying to make its own way to the betterment, to aid the voice for the other countries to work together. So effort has been made by EU, and I know for certain there are a lot of work which are pending in summit. Others have received results, others are on the way to come up later. But definitely the issue of the climate change has been of the paramount importance in seeing to it that Africans are speaking as one voice. This is a beginning, and I'm very sure that we could do a lot in the future in that regard.
Thank you. Madam Minister, I mean, South Africa has a very strong view on climate change issues, and in fact, in some ways, because of the level of development of the South African economy, has different issues to much of Africa. I mean, you are a more industrialized economy. How did you find it to be part of a common position coordinated by the Prime Minister of a country which has, Prime Minister Melez's country obviously has very different environmental issues to yours. Did it work, having one African voice on these issues?
Well, let me start by saying that the phenomenon of unity in Africa is a very old one. Starting from the OAU, which helped us to fight colonization, and up to the AU. So at a political and developmental level, you have this unified voice of Africa. As the Prime Minister alluded to, the NEPAD program is a voice of unity from Africa, calling for development. So for also, if you look at the sector, we are also unified along the sectors, sectorally, so to speak. We have a body for water in the continent, the African Ministers' Council on Water. I think it's a unique situation in the world. We have a body for environment, which really made it easy for us as South Africa to feel that we're part of Africa, we are of Africa, from Africa. But we appreciate also that we are not homogeneous in terms of our strengths and our national interests. So we had to accommodate Africa's needs as part of Africa's position. Otherwise, it is in our interest to make sure that we all succeed as a collective, not for us to be, to get the lion's share, but to be part of the collective. And so to speak, South Africa has acknowledged that we are the biggest emitter in the continent because we are the biggest industrialized economy. So we are taking targets. And I think we are the only country that is taking targets for that reason.
Thank you. Donald, you have a very particular role in all of this, in that you were very involved last year in the coordination of Africa's response to the global financial crisis. You were part of the Africa team that came to the G20. How do you look at this issue of arriving at a single voice?
Thank you very much, Mark. I agree with my colleagues that Copenhagen was, I think, well articulated by the Africans. And I think we should thank the African Union and Prime Minister Meles for that. But I think beyond having one voice, it should be an effective voice. And from how I see it, I think the concern is that in many of these international issues, when people come to the summit, the deal is almost done. Because the negotiations have been going on for months in different forums, where our voice has not been able to input the issues. And I think concentration on the final summit is a reflection of the weak capacity of many countries to participate in that process. And so when the crisis hit, the financial crisis that is, and we're a financial institution, what we did, I consulted my colleagues in the African Union, Mr. Ping, and the head of the ECA, and the head of the Economic Commission for Africa, African Union Commission, heads of the regional economic communities. I said, what do we do? Let us get together and advise our leaders on how to respond to this crisis. So we met in Tunis with finance ministers and governors. We analyzed the issues technically. We took a position. We created a mechanism of follow-up of the crisis, a committee of 5 ministers of finance, 5 governors of the central bank, and on a regular basis we meet and we advise our leaders accordingly at how we see the evolution of the situation. At the moment, for example, we're very concerned at the emerging conversation on a new architecture of banking regulations. Because from the viewpoint of where we sit, you can have as many regulations as you want, but if there's no effective supervision, there'll be a problem. Now, supervision means the capacity to supervise financial institutions and follow up with remedial measures. And we're working on that on behalf of the African governments, so that by the time people are ready to come in with a new architecture of regulations, we have been able to input into the process. That is what I have seen as a major lacuna, to be able to have an effective voice, influencing issues far ahead the final summit, which puts a final seal on the deal.
Thanks very much, Donald. Let's, if I may, sort of look at a couple of these institutions where there needs to be a strong African voice, and perhaps we could start with the G20, because it was very important to Britain when Gordon Brown chaired the G20 that there be proper African representation. And as you all know, South Africa has a chair in its own right, but it was felt important that there also be an African chair able to speak for the region as a whole, and South Africa was a very strong supporter of that. So Prime Minister Gordon Brown invited Prime Minister Meles in his role as the governmental, the head of government chair of NEPAD to play that role. But there is an issue, which is, was Africa adequately involved in the summit preparation of the communique and the Sherpa process? Is this arrangement of an invitation just from the host country sufficient, or do we need to institutionalize Africa's representation in the G20 on a firmer footing? I wonder if any of you would like to sort of offer a comment on that issue, and perhaps, Donald, we might start with you, because you're the one who's been most involved with this issue.
No, this is what I was saying, Mark. Prime Minister Meles was invited to London, and he kindly asked Mr. Ping and myself and Abdullah to accompany him. same for Pittsburgh. But we are absent in the shaper process.
Yeah.
In the discussions, in the negotiations over the texts, over the months leading to that final summit, there's no African input. And for me, that is a big problem. I think the photo opportunity at the end is fine. To be able to influence a particular aspect of the communique is fine. But I think what is important is that Africa has a voice in the whole process leading to the final outcome of the summit. Let alone the fact that I find it completely odd that this continent of 1 billion people is absent from the G20 process. I feel that the G20 would aid in the legitimacy if it accepted that issues of development, issues of poverty have their place, and therefore countries like Bangladesh, 200 million people, Africa with 1 billion people has a legitimate right to be there so that issues of development can be articulated. Because if you look at systemic issues, migration issues are systemic issues, poverty issues are systemic issues, and I think the G20 will gain legitimacy by having Africa sitting there, but also throughout the process. Now, I do understand you can't have G150, but whatever G combination you have, it is important to have an effective voice of those who have a stake in the process, especially when in a financial crisis like this, it was not Africa which was the origin of the crisis. And so it is legitimate to say, in the search for a solution, we have the right to have a say throughout the whole process.
Yes, Madam Deputy Secretary General, can I add a question just for you to answer as well, which is what's the role of ECOSOC in this? Because, the UN does have a forum which is more than 20, but are less than 192, and which is balanced between different regions of the world, and which has traditionally not been able to provide the forum that might be a balanced but manageable size in terms of handling these issues.
First of all, I wanted to emphasize what Donald has just said, that Africa is not there at the time when it matters, in as far as the G20 processes are concerned. And as we sit right now, we already know who is going to host G20 this year. We know who is going to host G20 next year. So when does Africa come in? And even with the presence of South Africa there, is there a mechanism that can still be used to have even the little that needs to be heard go through as G20 prepares itself? So this is a challenge that we have to look at. At the United Nations, generally, I can say there are challenges there to get the African countries to come together on a number of issues. Climate change was one of them, but as we all know, this was something that pulled together the whole world almost in a similar intensive way. But there are so many other issues that relating to development that we deal with at the United Nations, you know very well, development, the MDGs, human rights, and so on. African voice there is not strong. Coordination is a challenge of even getting to get this one position go through. Now, as far as the ECOSOC is concerned, you have rightly said, is how many countries? Is it 30? It is 30. Yeah. I think it is 30, between 20 and 30, but it is 30, I think, members. And again, this is an organ that needs to be strengthened in each way. First of all, to have the countries understand in a deep way the issues that are being discussed. That is a challenge. And then there is participation. You have some countries with capacity to articulate the issues, to analyze them. You have countries with the capacity to attend the processes leading to ECOSOC, and a good number of African countries do face challenges there. So much as this stands to be an important entity, an important organ of the United Nations, economic and social, where Africa should be at the center of it, it is not that effective. And in the context of system-wide coherence, which you know very well, we're looking into ways to strengthen the capacity to participate effectively and meaningfully. But I want to assure you that we have a long way to go in that way. And maybe in the course of the discussion here, we might be able to get a few suggestions on how best we can do this.
Let me ask the three, if you like, politicians on the panel, starting with the President. I'm going to put to you a difficult question, and I don't expect you to respond to the country I'm going to raise directly, but you know, at the moment there are elections forthcoming for the UN Human Rights Council. And you know, lots of parts of the world, including Africa, take this body extremely seriously. There are others who complain that it's, you know, not effective, not representative. I think it's fair to say that a lot of NGOs in Africa and elsewhere are at the moment very upset because Libya is on the list, the African slate, to be elected to the council. Now again, I'm not expecting you, you know, to defend or I don't want, I'm not, it would be improper to ask you to say whether Libya's human rights record is a problem or not. But certainly amongst NGOs, there's a feeling when there are so many African countries who've paid so much attention to human rights and have such a good record on human rights, why can't Africa, for something like this, put up countries which are a real kind of example of human rights for these jobs? Because, you know, doesn't it weaken Africa's voice on these institutions if there are countries that don't seem to embody human rights? Mr. President, is that a fair criticism, and is it something that Africa should be concerned about?
I think that it's unfair to ask Africa to choose who should represent them, because the way we do it here in Africa is that countries offer themselves to belong to certain committees, human rights, and so on. And so once a sister country, such as the one you referred to, offers itself, we can't say, no, not you, but the other. In any case, the NGOs that you refer to are most active in the countries that you are thinking about, that you think are paying more attention to human rights issues and so on. They are free to be there, they are accredited, and they move freely. But the countries that you are talking about, they most probably don't even go there. They criticize them from a distance. So it's unfair to ask us to decide who should. It's difficult, but we do solve problems, even like that, even leadership problems within Africa itself. If a country offers to itself as a leader of one of our organs, and we don't think so, we normally find a way of sorting out these problems in a quiet way. We have to be delicate about it because, as you know, we are at the beginning of our unity process or journey, unlike yourselves who have already achieved it in Europe. So I think that it's the case of the country that you referred to. In order to get there, they will have to convince the other countries to support them. And I think that's where the diplomacy of African politics and unity come into play. We all care about human rights. I'm sure we do, because in each one of our countries, there are efforts being made. Perhaps not to the speed, not as fast as the world would like us to move, but we do care, but we have to balance between the human rights and other considerations, like economic considerations and so on. I was listening the other day on Labor Day to a speech made by one of the union leaders in Zambia, and it struck me as a very impressive argument he had regarding child labor, for instance. And he said, look, in my tribe, this is the tribe of the unionists, in my tribe, a young man is not matured. He has not grown up to be a proper young man unless he can herd cattle. He must go to the bush and look after cattle for a certain period while going to school or not going to school. But as a proper tribesman, he must know how to herd cattle. And he went on to say that going to work with the mother and father, going to the fields with a smaller hoe than his parents, is not child labor. He says he has to know. There's no other way of livelihood for an African child living in a village. But the NGOs would come and say, this is child labor. And that creates a conflict. What is the substitute for that? How do you expect this child to know how to grow food if he's going to depend on the food that he grows. So when they come to a country, the NGOs say that, no, there's too much child labor here. I think it's different from, for instance, in England, when you take a child into a mine, into a coal mine, and I've seen films of it where the children at that time, not anymore, suffered quite a lot. But in the African village, it's a social occasion to be with your parents in the fields. So these differences between the understanding of the NGOs, which originate from the developed countries, from Western Europe, and ourselves, our true environment in which we live, has to be understood. You know, even the way we solve our problems, we can tell very easily if a child has been studying in England, for instance, for a long time. When he walks in front of people, because England is cold, so you normally keep your hands in the pocket, running away from the cold. But he will come to Africa and do the same. And he's coming for an interview and he has his hands in the pocket. Immediately I'm prejudiced towards him. He's not properly educated. Because with us, the moment you see older people and so on, you have to pause in a certain way, you have to speak in a certain way, and so on. And all these conflicts of understanding of the cultural differences between people makes a conflict between many of our governments and the NGOs. May sound very superficial, but I think that we have that problem in Africa. You have to understand us, and we think that even when we have problems amongst ourselves, it's like family problems in the house. You don't quarrel with your wife in front of people. You wait until the people end and you start quarreling again. So it's the same. Our representation is something we have to tailor very carefully in such a way that we can continue to talk to one another and to cooperate until we reach your level of cooperation. Thank you.
Mr. President, thank you. I'm sure we'll come back to that issue in the questions. Let me just quickly, before we turn over to the floor, Mr. Vice President, I mean, you know, perhaps we've taken this Human Rights Council issue far enough, but Tanzania was a very successful member of the Security Council as a non-permanent member. Here's another body where more formalized African representation is still not solved, where the issue of Security Council reform and expansion has stalled. Is this a priority, do you think, for Africa to insist on permanent membership in the Security Council?
Yes, it is still a priority. You see, when you talk of Africa, and everyone understands, you talk of a big continent with about 53 countries which form the members of African Union. And if you compare these 53 countries with other countries who have permanent member in the UN, you could see the unjustified way of so as to say, leadership. And therefore, Africans have every reason to request, not try to request, but to send a proposal for the permanent member in the Security Council. If it has been very well resolved for other countries, as individuals, although they are powerful, you can't leave Africa the way it should be for the next century or so. It's a decision which needs to be done by the member state of UN, so that Africa should represent itself and should speak that one voice we're talking about for its own development. Whether we get one place or two places, it doesn't matter, but Africa should have its permanent seat in the UN. And it has been a deliberate decision by the leaders of the African Union since the year 2003, 2004, although the cry was being made quite many years ago. But it's important that the nations should realize that Africa needs to run its affairs, need to have representation in the UN. And we are not so much pleased with what is taking place now. In other words, there has been a delay in embarking on the reform for UN, so as to say. And we anticipate that the sooner the better if this issue is resolved for Africa to be very well represented.
Thank you. Minister, South Africa is, obviously this is very central to all these discussions about Security Council enlargement, G20. Be interesting to hear where you think the debate on the Security Council is, but also perhaps a little flavor of what your assessment as South Africa is of your first year or so of participation in the G20 at the heads of government level. Has that been useful? Do you feel that South Africa is getting a bigger voice on the global stage as a consequence of that?
I'm not sure if I want to answer that one. I wish somebody else could peer review South Africa on that one. But I will hazard, I will attempt to respond to your question, Mike. I think I want to make a point first about Africa's participation and its seat in the Security Council. To say that Africa is part of the global village. And so it has to make a contribution on the matters of the world and in trying to bring answers for the problems of the world. What we need as Africa, which has been alluded to by everybody who are speaking here, we need the right platform or platforms for us to make that kind of contribution. I think we're very capable. We're capable, we do have answers to some, not to everything, but surely we can make an invaluable contribution. As for South Africa, I would say to a certain extent, it has given us some, prominence. Yeah. But we all do that on behalf of Africa, I hope.
Thank you. Arthur, would you like to open the remarks? The mic, and not that I think you need it, but you should probably, when you get the mic, also introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Arthur Mutambara from Zimbabwe. I want to start on the issue raised at the beginning, the issue of regional economies and regional integration. I think the problem is the benefits and the costs have not been emphasized enough. In my mind, regional integration is a survival paradigm. If we don't have regional economies, we can't survive globalization. South Africa won't make it as South Africa, they'll make it as SADC, they'll make it as the AU. So we got to embrace regional integration as a must. We're moving away from the notion of national competitiveness to regional competitiveness. South Africa won't be competitive if Zimbabwe is being naughty next door. Mozambique won't be competitive unless the region is competitive. We're moving away from the notion of regional attractiveness. We're moving towards regional attractiveness and regional competitiveness. Then Europe, I agree with you, have done very well. The only problem I have with Europe is that you don't acknowledge that you have learned from Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah is the father of regional integration. When we learn from Roosevelt, when we learn from Churchill, we acknowledge. When we learn from Michael Porter, we acknowledge. We want Europe to say, thank you, Kwame Nkrumah, for educating Europe. All these ideas of regional integration and all these things are coming from Nkrumah. So we want you to acknowledge. Last one is the cheap shot. The question on Libya is a naughty question. Unacceptable. What's wrong with Libya? I thought England and Libya cut a deal, and I saw Blair going to a tent and cut a deal with Gaddafi, and they're trading now. Saudi Arabia is not a democracy, but they're friends with America. Kuwait is not a democracy, they are friends with America. America gave us Savimbi. They gave us Saddam Hussein, they gave us Osama bin Laden. The problem with this question coming from Europe to Africans, we are saying, why are you asking us to justify Gaddafi's activities when you are friends and creators of dictators in Africa? So there's nothing wrong with brother Gaddafi being in that committee. And if there's anything wrong, I'll entertain it coming from Africans, not from you in Europe or from America. Thank you very much.
Good. All right.
Thank you. My name is Eleni Kabramatin, head of the Ethiopia Commodity Exchange. I think the call has been repeatedly made by the panelists for a seat at the table. However, I would like to go to Mr. Kaberuka's comment that it's not just having the voice, but having an effective voice. And part of what makes the voice effective is the repository of knowledge and analytical capacity in order to engage meaningfully. And it seems that some of our institutions are still behind, in my view, in providing that knowledge powerhouse to inform the voice that we are trying to get. So for example, we go to FAO looking for African production statistics. There is no African knowledge base for understanding and analyzing our own economies, our own realities, our own conditions. So we often look, in my own country, repeatedly we see consultants and external organizations providing much of the knowledge about ourselves. So to me, when we look at how negotiations are done, unless the teams that go to negotiate on behalf of us are able to draw on our own capacity, then we're always at a disadvantage, and that voice is always weak, in my view. So I think some of what I would like to pose to the panel is where in Africa, in the many institutions, there are many, many institutions, where there's ECA, Development Bank, NEPAD, and every day there seems to be a new one. But where really can we focus the same way that Europe has created in Brussels a very strong knowledge base to move forward? Which of these institutions should be housing this, and how can we strengthen that? Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Kes Kavadia. I head up the Banking Association of South Africa and also been doing some work on an African task force under UNEP for sustainable finance. I just want to ask the panel, I think that I fully agree we need to have a voice, we need to have our space. But in the UNEP work that I've been sort of to a certain extent involved in, my sense is that we're not, as Africa, beginning to inform the sustainability agenda, particularly within the context of the conditions in Africa. So what does climate change mean within the context of extreme poverty? What does climate change mean within the context of situations of crisis, situations of war? And similarly with other sustainability issues. I think that the agenda is still very European-driven. And we go to Copenhagen, we go to these fora, and what we essentially doing is inputting into what is essentially still a European agenda. And I just need to get a sense from the panel whether we are beginning to inform that agenda on the basis of the particular conditions in Africa and in other emerging continents.
So, yes, two gentlemen at the back there.
Yeah, my name is Josephat Maura from Kenya. Mine is actually a follow-up to that question. Especially those of you who are very experienced in these processes, how do you avoid the risk of what I would describe as tokenism? Being invited to legitimize a process that really you haven't participated in, you haven't engaged in, but because you have, at the end of the process, you actually get to participate and you legitimize the process. How do you avoid that risk? And then my second question is, having been so experienced, especially perhaps Dr. Kaberuka and Migiro, what are you doing to build capacity of others, to develop others, to take over where you have taken us to, in terms of enhancing the capacity of Africa to participate at this international forum?
Thanks.
I'm Laurent Sommet. I work for the Worldwide Fund for Nature, known as WWF. In the past year, there have been many efforts put into building regional economic communities such as SADC, COMESA, EAC, and ECOWAS. As part of the subject that we're discussing this afternoon, is the creation of regional economic communities is really contributing to shaping out one voice in Africa, or could be seen as a hindrance in shaping out this one voice in Africa?
Great. Any on this side? So, yeah.
Frank Bracken. I think we have made many references to the European community, but it's often forgotten what the history is of the European community. It started from a core of a couple of countries, and then they raised the standards, the entry standards, So the European community did not become as weak as the weakest link, but as strong as the starting strength. And maybe in the whole ambition of Africa speaking up as one, with one voice, there is a risk of everything becoming as weak as the lowest denominator. So the question is there not a need for recognizing that in the current circumstances it's just way too ambitious for Africa to be one common voice, but to find a locomotive, whether it is South Africa or an axe of countries that can be really a locomotive for Africa, to which then the whole of Africa links itself and lifts it up.
Great. Any other questions as well?
Yeah, Felix Mosha from Tanzania. I'm a UN retiree. I think on the question of the Security Council, in as much as the other side has a role to play, the permanent members, we as Africa have an even bigger role to play in terms of harmonizing our position, in terms of being clear who really goes there. I think they have used our differences in that decision as a way of probably keeping us out, because those who have been in have remained in, and those who are out have been kept out. So we have to strategize, we have to harmonize that position and say, well, it is country A or it's country B that we're in agreement, should go there, and we need the seat in the Security Council. And I think the seat in the Security Council is critical. But we still also have to talk of the Bretton Woods institutions. And that's really critical. We have remained the recipients of services from the Bretton Woods institutions. And we are if you are a business, we are the biggest customers. And I think at times you give your client a voice so that a client then kind of figures out how that client is being served. I do realize these are financial institutions, the weighted voting is important, but I think it was very important that Africa gets a proper voice in the Bretton Woods institutions and not simply become a recipient of policy prescriptions. And that's why it matters, because that is the economy. The speaker who concluded, I really think the greatest weakness in Africa is not to wait for a pillar for where to coalesce and say we are going to run around this pillar, is to integrate and integrate really fast. You know, other countries in the world are integrating in order to enhance their prosperity. Africa simply must integrate in order to survive. And that's fundamentally the issue. And I would say, well, I wouldn't blame any leader, but I would say that really we have been slow on this. There is no earthly reason why the integration process in Africa. We're talking of trade situations. We're talking of the North and North America and so on. And we in Africa ourselves, if we had opened up these borders early enough, if we are 1 billion people today, a population of 1 billion is huge by any standards. If we simply open our borders today and we trade 1 billion people, we might not even need the North that much. We will need it in terms of the exchange of trade, but we really can do much, much more. So I would say integration is critical to enhancement of one voice. Bretton Woods institutions, we have to take a serious look at it again, and we have to go back to the Security Council and press our case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Why don't we take some answers to these first issues that have been raised, and maybe we'll just start at the far end and work down, and every panelist should just pick up on the issues they particularly want to address. And I do think, you know, we've heard from the first questioner from Arthur right through to the end an awful lot of references to regional integration. And so it would be particularly good to hear a few comments on how that's going. I mean, the argument is hard to have one voice if you don't have one economy. So what is the progress, and which institutions are, in a sense, models of success in terms of driving integration? Donald, let's start with you, if we may.
Thank you very much, Mark. You know, since yesterday in all these panels, I've been sitting on the far right. And people have been saying, the man on the far right, and I've had protested. I'm not this British political party which is on the real far right.
Well, you'd be in power tomorrow if you were.
So thank you for saying I'm on the far end. I think President Banda mentioned something which should not be glossed over. He said if understood properly, we are at the beginning of a long process of integration. And we have to be realistic. It's difficult, it's complex. Already look at Europe and the Euro area, look at the challenges they're having, including by the challenges of statistics, in terms of knowing what happens in the fiscal positions of some of the members. So it is complex, it is difficult, it requires political will, it happens iteratively. Some regions of Africa are making faster progress than others, that is natural, but the most important thing is that we keep moving. I don't think it will happen simply by a magic wand. It will happen by political will, hard work, and building on achievements which are real today. I did say yesterday in one of the panels that if this continent has resisted to the crisis that we have, is in part because of the growing regional trade on the continent. And the head of WTO and I are busy trying to document the numbers. They're quite impressive. So things are happening. Of course, free movement of people causes problems. Often you blame politicians. But I'm reminded of a story in West Africa in the 80s. ECOWAS leaders wanted to accelerate free movement of peoples. And the first country to oppose this was Liberia under Samuel Doe. Because then he thought that people would be moving from Ghana, which was very poor then, to Liberia. It ended up being the reverse direction because Liberia wanted to see war and Ghana was moving forward. And so there are really issues we have to look at and understand that our politicians have to deal with political realities. The second point about capacity to negotiate is real. That is a problem. I agree. I agree. And there I think the African institutions like ourselves, Economic Commission for Africa, AU Commission, have a role. I want to tell you that, for example, the paper which went to the G20 in London on behalf of Africa was done by the three institutions. We did the work, we submitted our analysis, and Mark, who was then Minister of State in Foreign Office, was extremely helpful in getting this material into the process. Now, which brings me to the issue of tokenism. I don't agree. I don't agree that Prime Minister Meles or ourselves went to G20 in London as a token. We don't agree. We don't agree. It is an issue of working with friends who accept the fact that Africa has to be on the table. And Gordon Brown, as chair of the G20 in London, and his team fought very hard to ensure that at least Africa is on the table. And I don't think that refusing to work with friends, what I call a negative power to say no, will be the best way to proceed. It is to say the door is open, I get on the table, these are my views, including the views people don't want to hear, i.e. that Africa is not adequately represented. But I don't think refusing to go would be the right response to what we call tokenism. And I don't certainly think that Meles or I or any African leader would accept to be treated as such.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, moderator. I think for me, the question to ask, firstly, let me say we are aspiring to have our voice represented in all of these platforms. But do we have the power as Africa? And I won't answer that question, I'll leave it at that, because really it's the power of being able to open those doors for you to be able to participate. And for me, it talks to the, it's quite central to the issue that we're raising here, of having Africa represented in the Bretton Woods institutions, for an example. Who opens that door for us? And how? And I want to maybe comment a bit on the tokenism issue, because all of these should be seen as efforts of trying to get in, so that when you are inside, then you make your voice heard. So I'm saying the how part of it is very important. I will leave it at that because I think I'm a bit provocative there. The issue that I wanted to respond to was the issue that Kes was raising, asking as to whether there was an African interpretation, for an example, of the climate change debate. And I would say yes, an attempt has been made. If you look at the fact that there is a common position as presented in the Nairobi Declaration. That is quite clear, one voice, but with the interpretation of the whole debate of climate change, based on our challenges as Africa. For an example, we are saying the overriding priority for Africa is poverty alleviation. So in the process of dealing with the effects of climate change, you have to prioritize poverty alleviation. That's the first thing. That's why the outcome that we're looking at a balanced outcome that will balance development imperatives with climate change imperatives, because that's the way to go for Africa. But we also said we are vulnerable as the least developed continent. We are the most vulnerable continent to the vagaries of climate change. So we said we will push for adaptation. For us, adaptation is imperative. It has to be accommodated there. It has to be funded. That's the second thing. But the most important issue in your question is what this lady raised. What then do we do with that knowledge so that everybody is able to access that knowledge? At this point, it is at a particular level. And I would agree with the point of establishing institutions so that you are able to give that knowledge there and you make that knowledge accessible to all Africans.
Thank you. Let me first of all continue with the issue of climate change. Now I would like to remind everybody who is in this auditorium that the issue of climate change, where it is given example of our common voice, our one voice for Africa, it has been worked thoroughly through a series of approaches as of the Kyoto Protocol itself, the Bali framework, the Nairobi meeting, Poland also meeting, and many others. And all these other processes whereby a conclusion was to be reached in Copenhagen. What was reached in Copenhagen, where most of African leaders and other leaders of the world attended, we managed to achieve something important from that meeting. I remember very well the UN Secretary, I was in Hamburg that very day when he said a deal has been reached. I left earlier in Copenhagen due to travel arrangements. But it is true that there are success stories in that very important accord. And Tanzania recognized the accord as an important step forward towards addressing climate change. However, we know for certain that it has a number of gaps in terms of substance, and we think these gaps will need time to readdress them, especially in forthcoming meetings. But main issues which we think are very important and necessary for us, as my predecessor mentioned here, that we are the one who are suffering a lot in the issue of climate change, the African countries. But we also put forward the very important issue of the issue of forests. The forest ecology system, which we have a lot in our countries. Tanzania itself has about 33.3 million hectares of forests. And we don't receive the amount of returns to these forests, which they are taking part in reducing emission of the green gases. Some of these forests, they've been here before us, and they are taking part in reducing the emission. But nothing has been compensated to African countries and many other countries. And we are very clear in this issue that a modality should be worked out on how these forests should work for the poor people, for the reduction of poverty, and also for the sustainable development in our countries. We are talking of the RAID Plus program, which has been accepted within the context of the Copenhagen Accord. I know efforts are being done by a number of donors in supporting our countries in implementing the RED plus documenting processes. These and many others. The transfer of technology, which we mentioned, is the prerequisite for our countries to embark on the climate change. I don't know, each country has been affected by its own levels. Tanzania, for instance, we've been suffering a lot. For those of you who know and who read a lot, even in internet, how much Mount Kilimanjaro is being suffering from the glaciers being melted, how much Tanzania have suffered in terms of level of ocean rise in different coastal towns. There is a small island in Tanga region where the island has been submerged, and many other areas, especially the coast part of another island of Zanzibar and Pemba, is in a critical position whereby the coastal erosion is taking place. Don't mention the droughts where Tanzania lost a number of herd cattle last year. A number of districts in Tanzania could not receive the intended production of agriculture. And therefore, we are affecting. And what has been achieved so far is it deserves to be mentioned that a good work and our voices has been heard. I would like also to react with the other question. Say, if you participate in an activity where you are not involved, don't you think that you are just pulled in? And how you can avoid getting out of that? I say this world we are living you can't live on your own in this world. You have to live we are living with others. There is interdependence between our countries, our governments, by the donor communities, and the world at large. If you are not invited to participate in activity, it doesn't mean that necessarily that you should ban. You should get out from that particular issue. You should be part and parcel because somebody else is participating in your country. It is important that your country should be involved. And those who have been appointed for negotiation, they are the ones who are doing the good work. Not anybody and everybody can participate in negotiation. Some of us, we don't have skills in negotiations. I remember very well yesterday, His Excellency President Kikwete said, you can't ask the politician to go and negotiate the issue of petrol and gas production in your country. You have to get the right person in doing the right word. So participation is one, but the product of the negotiation in the participation is of prime importance. The issue of regional integration, this is a very serious issue, and we'll need to look to be very careful, really, in addressing the issue of regional integration. Nothing can be achieved in 24 hours. I very well remember the East African Community, which the initial one, which was terminated in 1977, before we re-established again the East African Community, now with 5 member states in the process. So when you want to integrate anything, you have to look for, it's a process. It's a process which you need to do a number of things. And to integrate countries, it needs time, it needs effort, it needs resources, human resources, financial resources, and other resources. You cannot wake up early in the morning and say, today we are deciding to unite country A and country B, and then unite the whole, and then integrate the African countries in a day. That's next to impossible. So integration is a process. It's not an event. It needs to be prepared fairly well. We have to work thoroughly for it. That's why we in East Africa are doing it step by step. The custom, then comes the financial of the community, and then finally the political integration, which that should be done in step by step. You can't walk all a sudden and say we want it today. There should be. I remember the 2 schools of thoughts, that of the late Kwame Nkrumah and that of the late Mwalimu Nyerere. Both of them, they were talking of African Federation, but in different approach. And the best approach is the approach of the step-by-step approach, which one needs to take his time, see that if that coat suits your body, and then you try to put on that coat. And you don't necessarily need to put any coat, which sometimes will be an oversized, like pajama, you see. And that way will be very well. So these were my remarks, Mr. Chairman. I would like to end. I didn't have the opportunity of saying a few words regarding to the NGOs. His Excellency Banda have said everything, but I want to say that as far a country like Tanzania, where democracy prevails and human rights is part and parcel of our constitution, we have some NGOs. There are two types of NGOs in our country, the international ones and localized ones. But some of these NGOs, they go beyond, they want to go beyond the rule of law of the country. And they want to do everything within their own mandate, and that is impossible. You have to respect the rule of law. You have to adhere to the principle of the country. We have been seeing some of these NGOs going all along to the villages and do their own research, do their own investigation without the prior consent of the authorities of the Ministry of Local Government or other authorities in the areas. And in so doing, if you take action against such NGOs, then you'll hear the issue of human rights coming up. So we have to implement the human rights standards accords, but also the NGOs likewise, they should also adhere to the principle of laws of our country, because countries are governed by laws, are governed constitution. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Asha-Rose.
Thank you very much. I would like to touch on a few points which other speakers spoke to as well. Looking at the role of regional integration in enhancing the voice of Africa, definitely if we look back, we will see that at the time we had the the OAU, it was at a political level. Economic aspects were not that well emphasized, but in the course of time that moved to the African Union. You have the commissions looking into the sectoral issues that matter to the continent. And this is something which has also enabled Africa to develop one voice, if they have not reached that one yet. But I believe this has been happening even before Copenhagen. Donald Kaberuka talked about the meeting they had, the meeting of finance ministers to address the question of the financial crisis. This was facilitated by the ADB, African Union Economic Commission for Africa, which is a United Nations Economic Commission. And it has a department that does capacity building as well. At the Secretariat, we have the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, which supports countries, including African countries. And one aspect of its work is capacity building in the area of statistics, which again is also taken up within the African Union commissions. And this means that it will improve the knowledge, because exchange of information, data collection, sharing this data is important in informing the processes that will eventually feed into the development of a common voice. So working through regional and sub-regional organizations in identifying common problems, developing common position is very, very important. We have seen, for instance, why climate change? Why do we talk of climate change as the point where we really had Africa speaking with the same voice, with one voice? Knowledge sharing is important. What the Vice President of the United Republic of Tanzania has said, it's information. Do we know what is happening in Kilimanjaro region, where I happen to come from? As I was growing up, I could see the snow cap. Now it is receding. Do we see some of these problems as transboundary? When Lake Chad is shrinking right now, do other countries see this as impacting themselves, impacting those countries as well? Because at times the challenge is that we may not appreciate the transboundary nature of the problems that we are facing, especially in climate change. Not that we are not aware, but appreciating and agreeing that we have to address this together, even though some of the things may not be that immediate. When we hear of landslides in Uganda, what does this mean for Tanzania, for Kenya, for other countries out there? Does this help Africa develop a common position? When we know that majority of the people in Africa, I think 60% or more, live in the rural areas, what is the impact of climate change? The land will shrink as a result of climate change. So really developing a common voice is something inevitable, but we have to have structures. We see these structures are working. Regional, sub-regional organizations are working on this. We need to strengthen. At the level of the United Nations, we need to work together with countries to build the capacity so that there is enough information, enough knowledge, and that it is adequately shared, and this informs the processes that are important in addressing the various issues. On the question of Security Council, that has been discussed. As a person coming from the Secretariat, this is in the hands of the member states. My good friend, Lord Malloch-Brown, knows this very well. It is done by the member states. We're there to help, to give information, but surely positions have to be developed from member states themselves, and I believe Africa will take its position to be part of the reform of the Security Council in a very effective and sustainable way. I think I should defer to His Excellency President Banda to continue.
Thank you. I think I have very little to say except that to repeat myself in saying that unity, speaking with one voice implies unity of the African countries, the 53 countries of Africa, all diverse and at different levels of development. It is inevitable for us to achieve this speaking with one voice as soon as possible. I just want to say that also we have to change our way of understanding the world. When we were, Lord Malloch-Brown, I don't want to say that you were there when I was learning this at school. At the time, I went to university in Sweden. The first lecture we had from our professor was that if you have a big population in your country, you are doomed. The economy will never succeed. That's why you have to have birth control. You know how they have it in Sweden. You have to have only one child or two children or three children. But if you have too many children and the population is too big, you'll never be able to unravel your economy and never be able to be wealthy. We all know that that has been proved to be false. All the countries with big populations are today perhaps the countries of the future economically. China, India, Indonesia, and all these countries. And therefore, Africa itself can count itself amongst those continents that will pick up if they come together. So I think that the thinking has to change, and that we have to take advantage of the big numbers that our continent has. Over 1 billion people. By the time we get together, perhaps we'll be 1.5 billion people. So we have to start to regard this as a challenge for the good that we are so many in Africa. As to where we get the knowledge, I think there was a young lady here who said that we don't have a database, we don't have information. We don't need that anymore. The world is one as far as that is concerned. You can get all the information that you require from any country in Africa or on the internet. You can find all the information that you need in order to develop your country. What we need in Africa, in my opinion, is what the example of Zambia itself. If Zambia, and therefore the countries around it, if we are all taking care of our countries properly, taking care of our environment, making sure that we have good infrastructure so that our people can trade and business can grow within Zambia itself, sooner or later we'll need to get the market from the other countries. But they must be able to get in. There must be roads and bridges and electricity for the new industries. There must be clean water, and there must be schools. All these things that are happening today in the African countries will bring us together eventually. But it cannot happen as long as even within our own country we can't move from one place to the provinces. These things are happening now, and Europe can help us to achieve this. And if I remember well, the statement yesterday by the president of Tanzania, President Kikwete, who said we need investment, we need countries from outside to realize that we need to develop. Why? Because the world is one now. Europe has to sell whatever they are making, these scientific inventions, its computers, its equipment, its aeroplanes. You need a market, and Africa has to be prosperous enough to be able to buy this. So we need each other. That's the point I'm trying to make, that we need each other, and therefore we should help each other to be at a higher level. Just as within the country itself, within Zambia, the country for which I'm responsible, we need as many people as possible to have a higher standard of living so that they can benefit from what the other person. We need the farmers, for instance, right, like now in Zambia, the farmers grow a lot of food by Zambian standards, but the market is depressed. When they go to harvest, they are paid very little because there's not enough people with money to buy their crops, the things that they are making. And we can't sell them across to the other countries because we don't have good roads, we don't have railway lines to be able to move the goods and so on. So we need each other, we need each one of our countries to develop so that we can achieve what I think the gentleman who's sitting over there saying that in Europe, when they came together, it was a group of countries who did. They set the standards. They said that you cannot join the European Union unless you have the following things. That will happen too in Africa. It has to be like that. I don't think there will ever come a time when all the 53 countries in Africa will come together and say, today we are united. This is what we are saying every day. It's a step we have to go on. And those who are cooperating, like in the SADC area to which I belong, we feel the impact of, say, South Africa's development. It is much easier for us to get spare parts for the things we want, but just a phone call. The next day you can have the spare parts for your hospital equipment, can have the spare parts for your roads and your railways, for any engines that we need for our development. We need each other so much so that we can develop and so that our own people are uplifted. But to imagine that we one day can meet and say we are now speaking with one voice when we have so many differences of standards of living, it's very difficult, but it will come. I'm seeing it more and more amongst the age group of my children, that they are much closer to each other because they have common things to talk about. They want to do things together. They want to visit each other. They want to do business together. And this is what, in my opinion, will give us the opportunity to speak with one voice. I think that also we should not worry too much about knowing everything because, as I say, the world is one. When I was in China 2 months ago, 1.5 months ago or 2 months ago, I was talking to the chairman of Huawei, which is one of the biggest ICT companies there, started by an individual who was in the army there, and then when he retired, he decided to start this company. It is now one of the biggest in the world. And I asked him, how do you deal with the problems of labor, the unions? How do you deal with your workers? He said, oh, we learned very quickly that it's better to involve the workers and give them a share of the company so that they feel involved, they feel to protect the industry and so on. And I said, but how did you learn that? He said, no, because we knew they were doing it in America and in England and in Germany. They were bringing their workers close to their industries and so on. So what do we do here in China? He told me, and it surprised me because we thought China had everything that they needed. I said, no, we learn all this from other countries, and we hire companies to advise us on how to involve the workers in our industry. In all these big corporations you see here in China, the American companies, German companies, consulting and advising them on how to involve their workers and share with them the wealth that is created as a result of all this. So we don't need to invent the wheel. It is there. As long as we are one global village and we are working together, we understand this, we can help each other. And I think that's the point that the convener of this meeting, perhaps not the convener, the host, the Tanzanians kept saying yesterday through President Kikwete, that we are one world and we really must learn to support each other. And that brings me back to the question of the NGOs, and I know NGOs are very vocal. I have found out since I became president that some, even local NGOs have learned the trick. They form NGOs without any purpose, just for the purpose of either supporting me or supporting my opponents and so on. So we can presume that even from outside, they're just people who get together and talk about it, because they are so negative about everything that you do in a country. And a country such as ours, most of us who are here, we need to be understood as to why we are doing certain things in a certain way. And you can't every day be harping on, no, this is not democratic. Democracy is new to us. And we must be complimented, really, as Africans, for trying our best to get the benefits of democracy. It's good. I think democracy is good. But they come there and they interpret it only in as far as they want. And I see this as a president. Fortunately, I'm an old man, so I'm very tolerant to a lot of people. I know some people are laughing. You think not all old men are tolerant, but yeah, I'm tolerant because I have my own children and I see how different they are from me. So I listen very carefully to what they are doing. And I think that the Europeans, in particular, especially us, the British, England, should be able to understand us, because they know how retarded we are educationally. There was not enough education given to our people when they were there. Perhaps it was not necessary. They just had to run the country and get enough labor to assist them to do what the purpose. But now, I would like to see like what happened in Kenya at one time. I don't know if some of you remember Tom Mboya. Tom Mboya exported something like 1,000 Kenyans to go and study in America. And that is the beauty of America. You can do it even with the private sector. But 1,000 Kenyans were sent to that place, and they came back to cause the development that is taking place in Kenya today. It was mostly the Mboya kids, the ones that went out, including the father of President Obama. The father of Obama. They went on that kind of program. I would like the big countries, the countries with a bit of money, to help us to educate our people more than what we are doing now. We have our own universities, and we're going to continue to allocate funds in our budget to educate our people. But there are certain things which we can't learn because we don't have the equipment, we don't have the institutions and so on. I'd like to see, for instance, 1,000 Zambians go to the United Kingdom and study there after they've finished at our universities and our secondary school. I'm not hearing that kind of thing anymore. It looks like everybody is busy saying, keep those people out there. We don't want them in our country. But we're one country, one world. We have to help each other. South Africa is very close to me personally, because many of the colleagues who are in South Africa there lived in Zambia during their struggle, and they're very kind to us, to the Zambians. Many Zambians have gone to South Africa to get jobs or to study. In many of the universities there, we have many Zambians who are studying there, and it's not as expensive as going to schools in Europe and to America. Perhaps they would consider lowering let us pay for our children, but don't let them pay as much as you are making them pay now, because we need education.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I think you've summed it up. You've done the moderator's job
Thank
as
you.
well as
Sorry.
the panelist's job. So let me just say, I think the real message of this was, if you're going to have one voice, you need one body. You need a much higher degree of integration and coordination in the economies of Africa, and that will help lead to one voice on the international stage. And I think we've heard of a lot of successful progress, from climate change to the G20 to the UN. So thank you all very much for a very, very rich discussion. Thank you.